The chandeliers blazed with 1,000 candles that night in 1835, casting golden light across the faces of Savannah's wealthiest families as they raised crystal glasses filled with deep red wine. Margaret Ellis moved through the crowd like a shadow, her dark hands steady as she poured vintage after vintage, her face an unreadable mask. But beneath that calm exterior, her heart hammered with the knowledge of what she had done, what was already coursing through the bloodstreams of every guest who had touched their lips to those glasses. By midnight, the screaming would start. By dawn, the bride and groom would lie cold in their wedding bower, and Margaret would be gone, vanished into a darkness that would swallow her whole. The grand Ashford Hall would stand empty for decades after, its doors sealed, its windows dark. Because some said if you listened carefully on quiet nights, you could still hear her laughter echoing through those abandoned rooms. The sound of a woman who had finally taken back what was stolen from her. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The story of Margaret Ellis began not in that glittering ballroom but 23 years earlier, in a cramped slave quarter behind the Pemberton estate, where her mother Clara died, bringing her into a world that would never see her as fully human. Margaret's first memories were of rough wooden floors, the smell of lye soap and sweat, and the constant ache of hunger that gnawed at her belly even when she had eaten. She learned early that tears brought nothing but harder work and harsher words. So she stopped crying before her 3rd birthday and never started again. The Pemberton family owned 42 enslaved people, and Margaret was raised among them, passed from one caretaker to another as each woman was sold away or died from the brutal labor that ground them down year after year. By the time Margaret was 7, she was working in the main house, small enough to fit into tight spaces to scrub floors and polish silver, her fingers bleeding from the harsh chemicals and rough bristles. Mistress Pemberton was a thin woman with sharp features and sharper words, who believed that idle hands were the devil's workshop and made sure no hands under her roof were ever idle. She would inspect Margaret's work with white-gloved fingers, searching for any speck of dust or tarnish that would justify the strap she kept hanging by the kitchen door. Margaret learned to be perfect, or as close to perfect as a child could be, because imperfection meant pain, and pain meant working the next day with welts that split open and bled through her thin dress. But Margaret was not like the other children in the quarters. She had a mind that absorbed everything around her, cataloging details and patterns that others missed. She watched how the white folks moved through the world, how they spoke and gestured, what made them smile and what made them rage. She learned to read their moods in the tilt of a head or the set of a jaw, and she used that knowledge to make herself useful enough to keep but invisible enough to avoid attention. This skill served her well as she grew older and was moved from scrubbing floors to serving at table, where she stood for hours holding platters or pouring wine while the Pembertons and their guests talked as if she were no more sentient than the furniture. It was at these dinners that Margaret received her real education. The men talked of politics and cotton prices, of land deals and slave auctions, speaking casually about buying and selling human beings as if discussing cattle or furniture. The women gossiped about scandals and engagements, about who was marrying whom and which families were rising or falling in Savannah's rigid social hierarchy. Margaret absorbed it all, filing away names and connections, grudges and alliances, building in her mind a detailed map of the white world that controlled every aspect of her existence. She learned which families were in debt, which men kept mistresses in the colored quarters, which wives knew about their husbands' activities and which ones pretended ignorance to maintain their comfortable lives. When Margaret was 14, something happened that changed the trajectory of her life forever. A new slave arrived at the Pemberton estate, a man named Moses who had been sold south from Virginia after his previous owner died. Moses was different from the other men in the quarters. He could read and write, skills he had learned in secret from the young son of his former master, and he carried himself with a dignity that no amount of bondage could strip away. He was older than Margaret by perhaps 15 years, with strong hands scarred from fieldwork and eyes that held both tremendous sadness and unbreakable will. Moses saw something in Margaret too, a spark of intelligence and rage that she kept carefully hidden from white eyes, but that burned bright when she thought no one was watching. Moses began teaching her in stolen moments, scratching letters in the dirt with sticks, showing her how symbols became words and words became power. Reading was illegal for enslaved people in Georgia, punishable by whipping or worse. But Margaret devoured every lesson with a hunger that exceeded even her physical starvation. She learned to recognize words on the papers that the Pembertons left scattered around the house, on the labels of medicine bottles and preserves jars in the kitchen, on the leather-bound books in Master Pemberton's study that she dusted but had never imagined she might understand. The world opened up to her in ways she had not thought possible, and with that opening came a deeper understanding of the full horror of her situation. Because once Margaret could read, she began to see how thoroughly the system was designed to keep her enslaved. She read advertisements for slave auctions in newspapers left on tables, descriptions of human beings reduced to their physical characteristics and dollar values. She read laws that declared her 3/5 of a person, property that could be bought and sold and bred like livestock. She read religious tracts that the mistress kept in the parlor, twisted interpretations of scripture used to justify holding other humans in bondage, claiming that slavery was ordained by God Himself. And she read, when she could steal a moment alone in the study, philosophical treatises about natural rights and human dignity that the master kept on his shelves. Words written by men who claimed all humans were created equal while simultaneously owning other humans and seeing no contradiction in it. The rage that had always simmered beneath Margaret's careful exterior began to boil. She looked at the Pembertons with new understanding, seeing them not as natural superiors, but as people who had built their entire lives on stolen labor and stolen humanity. Master Pemberton's fine clothes and expensive cigars were paid for with the sweat and blood of people he kept in chains. Mistress Pemberton's jewelry and silk gowns were purchased with money extracted from workers who received nothing but bare subsistence and constant cruelty. The Pemberton children, who Margaret had raised and cared for more tenderly than their own parents ever had, would inherit not just wealth, but an entire system designed to perpetuate the suffering of people who looked like her. But Margaret was not foolish enough to let her rage show. She continued to be the perfect servant, anticipating needs before they were spoken, moving through the house like a ghost, her face a mask of blank compliance while her mind worked constantly, planning and calculating. She listened more carefully now to the conversations at dinner parties, paying particular attention when the talk turned to poison. Savannah society was obsessed with poisoning in the 1830s, terrified of the power that enslaved people might wield through their control of food preparation. There were constant rumors of slaves poisoning masters, of entire families falling ill from tainted food, of mysterious deaths that were whispered about but rarely openly investigated because to do so would be to admit vulnerability, to acknowledge that the people they kept in bondage might have agency and power. The white folks discussed various poisons with a mixture of fear and fascination. They talked about arsenic, which could be obtained from rat poison and caused violent stomach pains and death. They mentioned belladonna, found in the wild and capable of causing delirium and heart failure. They whispered about oleander, which grew in gardens all over Savannah and was beautiful to look at but deadly if consumed. Margaret memorized every word, storing the information away for a future she could not yet clearly envision but knew was coming. She began to study the plants in the Pemberton garden and the surrounding woods, learning which were merely harmful and which were lethal, which worked quickly and which took time to kill, which could be detected and which left no trace. Moses watched Margaret's transformation with concern and pride in equal measure. He understood her anger because he felt it too, had felt it every day of his 40 years in bondage. But he also knew that anger without careful planning led only to death, usually brutal and public, designed to terrorize other enslaved people into submission. He counseled patience, urged her to wait for the right moment if a moment ever came, to think not just of revenge but of survival. But Margaret was young, and youth does not always value survival over justice. She smiled at Moses and nodded at his wisdom while privately continuing her studies, her preparations for something she could not yet name, but felt approaching like a storm on the horizon. The summer of 1834 brought changes to the Pemberton household. Master Pemberton had made a series of bad investments in cotton futures and found himself suddenly in need of ready cash. The whispers that Margaret overheard suggested he was on the verge of bankruptcy, that he might have to sell some of his slaves to cover his debts. The entire quarter lived in fear during those months, knowing that families could be torn apart at any moment, that husbands could be sold away from wives, children from mothers, all to satisfy a white man's gambling debts. Moses held Margaret close during that time, their relationship having evolved from teacher and student to something deeper, though they both knew it was a love that could be destroyed at any moment by a bill of sale. But the financial salvation that came to the Pembertons came in an unexpected form. Master Pemberton's younger sister had married well to a man named Cornelius Ashford, who owned one of the largest plantations in coastal Georgia and wielded considerable influence in Savannah society. The Ashfords had a son, Richard, who was 26 and still unmarried despite his mother's desperate attempts to find him a suitable wife. Richard was known throughout Savannah as a difficult man, prone to fits of temper and heavy drinking, handsome enough but with a cruel streak that made most respectable families hesitant to offer their daughters. But the Pembertons also had a daughter, Catherine, who was 19 and considered beautiful despite having no dowry and damaged family prospects due to her father's financial troubles. A deal was struck between the families. Catherine would marry Richard, bringing the Pemberton name and whatever social connections still remained intact, while the Ashfords would pay off Pemberton's debts and secure the family's financial future. Catherine had no say in the matter, of course, though Margaret heard her crying in her bedroom the night the engagement was announced. Margaret had no particular love for Catherine, who had pulled her hair and slapped her face often enough as a child, and had grown into a woman who treated enslaved people with casual cruelty. But even Catherine did not deserve to be sold to a man like Richard Ashford, though Margaret supposed it was fitting that white women learned what it felt like to be property, even if their chains were made of gold and their sails disguised as weddings. The wedding was planned for September of 1835, to be held at Ashford Hall, the family's grand estate on the edge of Savannah. It would be the social event of the season, with guest lists including the most prominent families in Georgia and even some dignitaries from as far away as Charleston and Atlanta. The Ashfords spared no expense in the preparations, determined to demonstrate their wealth and power through the sheer extravagance of the celebration. They brought in additional staff from their plantation to supplement the house servants, and among those transferred temporarily to Ashford Hall were several people from the Pemberton estate, including Margaret. Margaret arrived at Ashford Hall 3 weeks before the wedding to help with preparations in the kitchen. The house was enormous, far larger than the Pemberton home, with soaring ceilings and imported furniture and artwork that represented more wealth than everyone in the slave quarters combined would see in 10 lifetimes. The kitchen was a massive operation overseen by an enslaved woman named Bessie, who had been cooking for the Ashfords for 30 years and ran her domain with military precision. Bessie took one look at Margaret and assigned her to wine service, a relatively prestigious position that required a steady hand and presentable appearance. Margaret would be responsible for ensuring that glasses remained filled throughout the wedding feast, moving among the guests with bottles of imported French wine that cost more per bottle than a human life. The irony was not lost on Margaret, though she kept her face carefully neutral as she received her instructions. She would be invisible in plain sight, a dark hand attached to a bottle of wine, refilling crystal glasses while the white folks celebrated a union that was little more than a business transaction dressed in silk and flowers. She learned the layout of the great hall where the wedding would take place, memorizing the locations of doors and windows, noting which rooms were locked and which were accessible, mapping out escape routes she might never need but wanted to know anyway. She met the other servants who would be working the event. Dozens of enslaved people from various Ashford properties, all of them wearing the same mask of compliance while their eyes betrayed various degrees of anger, resignation, and exhausted defeat. Among the other servants was a young man named Josiah who worked in the Ashford stables. He was perhaps 20 years old, with the lean build of someone who worked hard but never got quite enough to eat, and eyes that held a spark of something dangerous. Josiah had tried to escape twice before, both times caught and brought back to brutal punishments that left scars across his back and a limp in his left leg. He should have been broken by those experiences, but instead they had forged him into something harder, more determined. He and Margaret recognized something in each other immediately, a shared understanding that some cages could not be endured no matter what the cost of breaking free. Josiah told Margaret about the networks of people who helped enslaved individuals escape, whispered legends of the Underground Railroad that moved people north to freedom in Pennsylvania and beyond. He spoke of safe houses and secret codes, of conductors who risked their lives to guide escapees through hostile territory, of former slaves who had made it to freedom and built new lives in places where they were recognized as fully human. Margaret listened to these stories with hunger, allowing herself to imagine a life beyond Savannah, beyond the Pembertons and Ashfords and all the other families who thought they owned her. But she was also practical enough to know that escaping was extraordinarily difficult, that the odds of making it to freedom were minuscule, that most people who tried ended up caught and punished in ways designed to terrorize everyone else into submission. As the wedding day approached, tension in Ashford Hall reached a fever pitch. Mistress Ashford was a woman possessed, demanding perfection in every detail while simultaneously changing her mind constantly about decorations, menu items, and seating arrangements. The enslaved staff bore the brunt of her anxiety, working 20-hour days to accommodate her endless demands, snatching a few hours of sleep before being awakened to begin again. Margaret worked in the kitchen and storage rooms, helping to prepare the elaborate feast that would feed over 100 guests. There would be roasted meats and delicate pastries, imported cheeses and fresh oysters, elaborate confections made with sugar that had been produced by enslaved people in the Caribbean and shipped north to sweeten the lives of people who had never felt the lash. It was during this time, while moving through the storage rooms taking inventory of wine bottles, that Margaret found it. Tucked away on a high shelf behind boxes of unused linens was a small glass bottle with a handwritten label that read "Rat Poison Arsenic Danger." Her hands trembled slightly as she took it down, feeling the weight of it, understanding immediately what had been delivered into her hands. Arsenic was a white powder, nearly tasteless, that could be mixed into food or drink and would cause terrible suffering before death. It was imperfect for her purposes because it could sometimes be detected by a metallic taste and because symptoms appeared relatively quickly. but it was available and accessible in a way that other poisons were not. Margaret stood in that dim storage room holding that bottle for what felt like an eternity, though it could only have been a few minutes before she heard footsteps and quickly returned it to the shelf. Her heart hammered in her chest as she returned to the kitchen, her mind racing with possibilities and consequences. She could poison the wedding feast, could strike back against the system that had stolen her life and the lives of everyone she loved, could make the Ashfords and their guests suffer as she and her people had suffered. But such an act would not be without cost. Enslaved people would be blamed, would be tortured to extract confessions, would be executed publicly to demonstrate what happened to those who dared to strike against their masters. The entire black community of Savannah would face increased scrutiny and violence in the aftermath. For several days, Margaret wrestled with herself. She thought about Moses, who she had left behind at the Pemberton estate and who would likely face punishment even though he was innocent, simply because they had been close. She thought about Josiah and Bessie and all the other servants at Ashford Hall who would be suspected and interrogated. She thought about the children in the quarters who would see increased brutality in the wake of such an act. And she thought about the alternative, which was to continue living as she had lived, watching people she loved be sold and worked to death, watching white folks celebrate their wealth and power while pretending that the foundation of their society was not built on bones and blood. The night before the wedding, Margaret lay awake in the cramped space she shared with 5 other women servants. She listened to their breathing in the darkness and tried to pray, though she was not sure anymore if there was a God who cared about the suffering of enslaved people, not when that same God was invoked constantly to justify their bondage. She thought about her mother, Clara, who she had never known, who had died bringing her into this world of suffering. She wondered what Clara would want her to do, whether her mother would counsel patience and survival, or would support striking back no matter the cost. But Clara was long dead, her body buried in an unmarked grave somewhere on the Pemberton estate, and she could offer no wisdom to the daughter she had never met. By dawn, Margaret had made her decision. She rose with the other servants and began the elaborate preparations for the wedding day, moving through her tasks with mechanical precision while her mind worked on a different level entirely. She would not poison the entire feast because that would kill indiscriminately, including enslaved people serving the food and perhaps some guests who had never personally harmed her. But she would poison the wine that would be served to the bride and groom and the head table where the Ashfords and Pembertons sat, the people most directly responsible for her suffering and the suffering of those she loved. It was not justice, not really, but it was something. An act of defiance that would at least disrupt the smooth functioning of a system that ground human beings into dust. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and warm, a perfect September day with just enough breeze to keep the heat bearable. Margaret worked with the other servants to transform Ashford Hall into a setting fit for the wedding of the year. Flowers were arranged in massive displays, filling every room with the scent of roses and gardenias. Candles were placed and lit, thousands of them creating a warm glow as afternoon faded toward evening. The great hall where the ceremony and feast would take place was magnificent, with long tables draped in imported linens and set with china and silver that represented generations of Ashford wealth. At the head of the room stood the bride's table, an elevated platform where the wedding party would sit, looking down on the assembled guests like nobility surveying their domain. As evening approached and guests began to arrive, Margaret retrieved the bottle of arsenic from the storage room where she had hidden it after taking it from the high shelf. Her hands were steady now, her fear burned away by the cold clarity of purpose. She had obtained several bottles of the finest French wine that had been set aside specifically for the head table, expensive vintages that the Ashfords would never serve to lesser guests. In a quiet corner of the butler's pantry, she carefully opened each bottle and added a measure of white powder to the deep red liquid, swirling the bottles gently to mix the poison throughout. The arsenic dissolved readily, leaving no visible trace, though she worried about the taste and hoped that the strong flavor of the aged wine would mask any metallic notes. With the poisoned bottles prepared and marked with a subtle scratch on the label that only she would recognize, Margaret returned them to the serving area and began her duties as guests filled the great hall. She watched from the edges of the room as Savannah society paraded in their finest clothing. Men in expensive suits and women in elaborate gowns that required the labor of dozens of enslaved seamstresses to create. They greeted each other with false warmth and genuine calculation, sizing up rivals and allies, gossiping about people not yet arrived, performing the intricate social dances that defined their world. Margaret moved among them like a ghost, refilling champagne glasses and offering wine, hearing snatches of conversation that revealed the shallow concerns of people who had never known real suffering. The ceremony itself was held in the great hall, with Catherine looking pale and brittle in her white gown as she stood beside Richard Ashford, and spoke vows that would legally make her his property. The minister presiding was the same man who preached on Sundays about Christian duty and the proper order of society, who had never once suggested that holding other humans in bondage might be incompatible with the teachings of the man they claimed to follow. Margaret watched Catherine's face during the ceremony and saw fear there beneath the powder and rouge. Fear that the bride tried to hide behind a practiced smile, but that showed in the tension around her eyes and the trembling of her hands. For just a moment, Margaret felt something like sympathy for the white woman, another person trapped by a system that treated women as property to be traded between men for financial and social advantage. But the moment passed quickly because whatever constraints Catherine faced, she still had choices and options that Margaret would never have. Catherine could inherit property, could move through society with respect and dignity, could expect that her children would be free and legally recognized as fully human. Margaret had none of those things and never would, not in the society that Savannah represented, not in a world where the color of her skin marked her as inherently inferior in the eyes of law and custom. So she pushed down the brief flicker of sympathy and returned her attention to her task, waiting for the ceremony to conclude and the feast to begin. As the newly married couple took their places at the head table, Margaret positioned herself near the serving station where she could observe everything. The other members of the wedding party arranged themselves along the elevated platform. Master and Mistress Ashford looking triumphant despite their son's reputation. Master and Mistress Pemberton clearly relieved to have secured their daughter's future and their own financial salvation. Various aunts and uncles and cousins who made up the extended family networks that controlled Savannah society. Below them at tables filling the great hall sat over 100 guests, the cream of Georgia society along with visitors from neighboring states, all of them dressed in their finest and prepared to eat and drink at the Ashfords' expense. The feast began with champagne and oysters, servers moving through the crowd with trays of the fresh shellfish that had been brought in packed in ice from the coast. Margaret was assigned to wine service at the head table, which meant she would be the one pouring from the special bottles she had prepared. Her heart hammered as she approached with the first bottle, a vintage that Cornelius Ashford had been boasting about all week, claiming it had been imported at tremendous expense and was among the finest wines in all of Georgia. She poured for the groom first, filling Richard's crystal glass with the poisoned red liquid, watching his face for any sign of detection but seeing only pleased anticipation. Then Catherine, whose hand trembled slightly as Margaret filled her glass, making the surface of the wine ripple in the candlelight. Margaret moved down the head table, pouring for each member of the wedding party, filling crystal glasses with death disguised as celebration. Master Ashford took his glass and held it up to the light, admiring the color and clarity, completely unaware that he was examining his own destruction. Mistress Pemberton sipped delicately and pronounced it excellent, recommending that Catherine drink freely as it would help settle her wedding nerves. Margaret maintained her mask of blank servitude, her face showing nothing of the screaming chaos inside her head, the part of her that wanted to warn them and the part that wanted to watch them suffer and the part that simply wanted to run. To escape this place before the consequences of her actions came crashing down. The feast continued with course after course, each more elaborate than the last. Roasted meats and delicate vegetables, rich sauces and fresh breads. Everything presented with artistic precision and consumed with the casual gluttony of people who had never wondered where their next meal would come from. The guests at the head table drank steadily from their poisoned wine, Margaret refilling glasses as they emptied, adding more death with each pour. She watched for symptoms but saw nothing at first. The arsenic working slowly through their systems, waiting to accumulate to lethal levels before announcing its presence. It was perhaps an hour into the feast when the first signs appeared. Richard Ashford paused in cutting his meat, a confused expression crossing his face as he felt the first stirrings of nausea in his stomach. He reached for his wine glass and drank deeply, thinking perhaps the richness of the food was simply too much, not knowing that he was adding more poison to his system with each swallow. Beside him, Catherine had gone pale, her hand pressed to her midsection. Her breathing becoming slightly labored, though she tried to hide her discomfort and maintain the appearance of a happy bride. One by one, the members of the head table began to show signs of distress, subtle at first but gradually becoming more pronounced as the poison spread through their bodies. Margaret continued to move through the room, serving wine to other tables, carefully ensuring that she only poured from the marked bottles at the head table and used untainted wine everywhere else. The other guests continued their celebration, unaware of the drama beginning to unfold on the raised platform. Too involved in their own conversations and consumption to notice the increasing distress of the wedding party. Margaret's hands remained steady as she poured, though inside she felt something like vertigo, a sense of having stepped off a cliff and being in freefall, knowing there was no way back from what she had done and no clear path forward either. By the time the main course was cleared and dessert was being served, it was clear that something was terribly wrong at the head table. Richard had pushed away from the table entirely, his face flushed and sweating, one hand clutching his stomach while the other gripped the edge of the table as if to steady himself. Catherine was weeping openly now, past caring about appearances, her body convulsing with cramps that twisted her features into a mask of agony. Master Ashford tried to stand but found his legs would not support him, collapsing back into his chair with a cry that finally attracted the attention of the other guests. Mistress Pemberton was vomiting into her napkin, her fine gown stained with wine and bile, while her husband sat rigid in his chair, his face the color of old parchment, his breath coming in short gasps. Chaos erupted in the great hall as people realized that something catastrophic was happening. Guests began shouting for doctors, sending servants running to fetch physicians from across Savannah. The other guests at the head table, those who had drunk from the poisoned bottles, were now showing varying degrees of distress, some clutching their stomachs, others struggling to breathe, all of them united in their suffering. The guests at the lower tables pressed forward, trying to see what was happening, speculation and rumor spreading through the crowd like wildfire. Some suggested food poisoning, others whispered about deliberate poisoning, eyeing the enslaved servants with sudden suspicion and fear. Margaret stood near the wall, her tray of empty bottles in hand, watching the scene unfold with a strange sense of detachment. She felt no triumph in watching them suffer, but neither did she feel guilt or remorse. She felt only a kind of emptiness, as if she had burned out something essential in herself and now existed in a hollow space beyond emotion. She knew she should run. should try to escape before suspicion fell on her. But she found herself rooted in place, unable to look away from the consequences of her actions. Part of her wanted to be caught, wanted to stand before them and explain exactly why she had done what she did, wanted to force them to confront the reality of the system they upheld and benefited from. But survival instinct finally overcame paralysis. As the first doctors arrived and began attending to the victims as other guests backed away in fear and servants were being roughly questioned, Margaret set down her tray and slipped quietly toward the kitchen. She moved through the chaos of the service areas, past other servants who were too shocked and frightened to notice her departure, out through a side door that led to the gardens. The night air was cool on her skin after the stifling heat of the great hall, and for a moment she simply stood there, breathing, listening to the muffled sounds of panic and anguish coming from inside the house. She thought briefly about going to find Josiah, about trying to convince him to run with her, but she knew that would only put him in greater danger. If she was going to have any chance of escape, it had to be alone, moving fast and leaving no trail. She stripped off the serving apron that identified her as part of the Ashford household staff and left it crumpled in the garden, then moved quickly toward the edge of the property. She knew the general direction of north, had memorized bits of information from her conversations with Josiah about escape routes and safe houses, though whether any of it would actually help her she had no way of knowing. Behind her, Ashford Hall burned with light and noise, every window blazing, voices raised in command and lamentation. Margaret could hear someone screaming, a high-pitched wail that might have been Catherine or Mistress Ashford or one of the other women of the wedding party, a sound of pure anguish that carried across the manicured gardens and into the darkness beyond. She did not look back as she moved into the shadows, following paths that wound through the landscaped grounds toward the surrounding forest. Her heart pounded and her breath came fast, but she did not run, knowing that running attracted attention, and that her best chance was to move steadily and purposefully like someone on an errand, not someone fleeing a crime. She reached the tree line and paused one last time, looking back at the mansion that was now in complete chaos. More carriages were arriving, more doctors and presumably some authorities coming to investigate what had happened. She could see figures moving in the lit windows, people gesturing frantically, the whole structure of Savannah society suddenly disrupted by death in its midst. Margaret felt a brief flicker of something that might have been satisfaction, knowing that she had struck a blow against the system that had stolen her life, even if it was a futile gesture in the grand scheme of things. Then she turned and plunged into the forest, leaving Ashford Hall and everything it represented behind her. The night was dark beneath the canopy of trees, only scattered moonlight penetrating the branches overhead. Margaret moved carefully, feeling her way forward, avoiding roads and cleared paths where she might be spotted. She had no clear destination, only a general sense that she needed to move north, away from Savannah, toward some mythical promised land where enslaved people could be free. She knew the odds were against her, knew that dogs would likely be set on her trail by morning, knew that the entire apparatus of slavery would mobilize to catch her and make an example of her. But she also knew that she would rather die free in the forest than live one more day in bondage, and that knowledge gave her strength to keep moving through the darkness. Hours passed. Margaret's feet began to bleed in the thin shoes she wore, not designed for hard travel through rough terrain. She was desperately thirsty, having had no chance to drink during the long hours of serving at the wedding, and she knew she would need to find water soon or risk collapsing from dehydration. She listened for the sound of running water, remembering that Moses had once told her that following streams could lead to sources of help, that some of the people who assisted escaping slaves marked safe houses near water sources. But the forest was confusingly uniform in the darkness, every direction looking the same, and she had no real navigation skills beyond a general sense of where north should be. As false dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, Margaret finally heard what she had been searching for, the burble of running water somewhere ahead. She stumbled toward the sound, emerging from the trees onto the bank of a small creek that ran clear over rocks and sand. She fell to her knees and drank deeply, the cold water shocking and wonderful after hours of thirst. She splashed water on her face and neck, washing away the sweat and grime of the night, and for just a moment allowed herself to feel hope that she might actually escape, that freedom might be possible. But hope was dangerous and fleeting. As full light came and birds began their morning songs, Margaret heard in the distance the sound she had been dreading, the baying of hounds on a trail. They had her scent, had probably started from the apron she left in the garden or from the servants' quarters where her smell would be on her belongings. The dogs would be faster than her, tireless and single-minded in their pursuit, and they would be followed by armed men on horseback who would have no mercy for an enslaved woman who had poisoned a wedding party. Margaret forced herself to her feet despite her exhaustion and pain. She waded into the creek, knowing that water might confuse the dogs temporarily, and began moving downstream, her feet slipping on the smooth rocks, cold water soaking through her dress. She moved as quickly as she could while staying in the water, the creek sometimes deep enough that she had to swim, other times shallow enough that she could walk. The sound of the dogs grew louder, then faded slightly as the water trick worked temporarily, then grew loud again as the hounds picked up her trail on the far bank or caught her scent in the air. The chase continued through the morning, Margaret pushing her body beyond exhaustion, operating on pure will and the animal instinct to survive. She left the creek when it turned south back towards Savannah and struck out through dense forest again, her dress torn by thorns and branches, her hands and face scratched and bleeding. She could hear the dogs clearly now, close enough that she could distinguish individual barks, and beneath that sound the voices of men calling to each other, coordinating their hunt. She was prey and they were predators, and this was a game they had played countless times before, a ritual reenactment of power and control. Margaret climbed a small ridge, her lungs burning, and looked back to see them perhaps a quarter-mile behind her, 3 or 4 hounds ranging ahead of a group of mounted men. She recognized one of the riders as the overseer from the Ashford plantation, a man known for his cruelty, who was probably relishing this chase and already planning what punishment he would inflict when she was caught. The sight of them galvanized her, gave her enough energy for one final desperate sprint down the far side of the ridge and into a hollow filled with thick brush. She pushed through the vegetation, thorns tearing at her already ruined dress, and found herself at the edge of a ravine. Below her, perhaps 20 feet down, was a narrow ledge covered in dense vines and moss. It was a dangerous drop, but the dogs were seconds away, and she made the decision in an instant, lowering herself over the edge and dropping the last several feet, landing hard on the ledge and rolling to absorb the impact. Pain shot through her ankle, but she forced herself to press back against the rock face, pulling vines and vegetation over herself, creating a crude camouflage that would not withstand close inspection but might work from above. The dogs arrived moments later, their barking frenzied as they lost her scent at the ravine's edge. She could hear them circling, confused, and then the men arrived, cursing and shouting commands. They argued about whether she had gone down into the ravine or continued along the ridge. The overseer wanted to split up, but another voice, one she did not recognize, suggested that she could not have survived the drop and they should search the ridgeline. Margaret pressed herself harder against the cold stone, barely breathing, watching through gaps in the vegetation as the men and dogs moved away, following the ridge eastward, away from where she hid. She waited until the sounds of pursuit had faded completely before allowing herself to move, and even then she remained frozen for what felt like hours, terrified that any movement would bring them back. The sun climbed higher, heating the ravine, and thirst returned with brutal intensity. Her ankle throbbed where she had landed wrong, swelling inside her torn shoe until she finally pulled the shoe off and let her bare foot rest against the cool stone. She examined herself in the harsh daylight and saw that she was in bad shape, covered in cuts and bruises, her dress little more than rags, her hair tangled with leaves and twigs. But she was alive, and for the moment she was free, and that had to be enough. As afternoon shadows began to lengthen, Margaret carefully climbed down from the ledge to the bottom of the ravine. A small stream ran along the ravine floor, the same creek she had followed earlier, and she drank again and tried to clean some of her wounds. She knew she could not stay here, that the men would eventually return when they failed to find her elsewhere, that she needed to keep moving north despite her injuries and exhaustion. She tore strips from what remained of her dress and bound her injured ankle as tightly as she could, creating a crude support that would at least let her walk. The ravine offered concealment and a water source, so she decided to follow it as far as it would take her north. She moved slowly now, conserving her strength, stopping frequently to rest and drink. As darkness fell again, she found an overhang in the ravine wall that would provide some shelter, and she crawled into it and finally allowed herself to sleep, dropping into unconsciousness so deep that she did not dream, did not think, simply existed in the darkness until dawn. Light brought her back to awareness and the brutal reality of her situation. The second day was harder than the first. Her body had stiffened overnight, every muscle screaming protest when she tried to move. Her ankle was badly swollen, purple and hot to the touch, and she knew it might be broken rather than merely sprained. She had no food and was beginning to feel the effects of prolonged hunger, a weakness that made her lightheaded and clumsy. But she forced herself to keep moving, following the ravine north, knowing that stopping meant death or capture, which amounted to the same thing. By midday, she heard the dogs again, distant but unmistakable. They had returned to search the ravine, probably with fresh hounds that had not been exhausted by the previous day's chase. Margaret pushed herself to move faster despite the pain, splashing through the stream, hoping the water would once again confuse her scent. She emerged from the ravine into more open forest and immediately realized her mistake. Without the ravine walls for cover, she was exposed, visible from a distance to anyone who knew where to look. She heard shouts behind her, had been spotted, and the chase was on again. This time she had no tricks left, no clever escape. She simply ran or tried to, her injured ankle betraying her with every step, sending bolts of agony up her leg that made her gasp and stumble. The dogs were gaining, their baying triumphant now that they had visual contact with their prey. Margaret knew she had only minutes, maybe seconds, before they reached her. She looked around desperately for any option, any way to escape or fight or at least die on her own terms rather than being dragged back to face torture and execution. Ahead of her, the forest opened into a small clearing, and in that clearing stood a structure that seemed to materialize from her desperate prayers. It was a small cabin, old and weathered, with smoke rising from a chimney despite the warm day. Margaret had no way of knowing who lived there, whether they would help or turn her in, but it was her only chance. She staggered toward the cabin, the dogs now so close she could hear their paws hitting the ground, and pounded on the door with both fists, screaming for help, though she barely had breath left to make sound. The door opened to reveal an elderly black man, his hair white with age, his face deeply lined, but his eyes sharp and assessing. He took in her condition and the sound of approaching dogs in an instant, grabbed her arm and pulled her inside, slamming the door behind them. He gestured urgently toward a trapdoor in the floor, already open, revealing a dark space beneath the cabin. Margaret did not hesitate, dropping into the hole despite her fear of enclosed spaces. The old man handed down a jug of water and a blanket, then lowered the trap door over her head, plunging her into complete darkness. She heard him moving furniture over the trapdoor, hiding its location, and then the dogs arrived, their barking frenzied as they scratched at the door. Men's voices followed, demanding entry, and she heard the door open and heavy footsteps on the floor above her head. The men searched the cabin roughly, throwing things around, questioning the old man about whether he had seen a runaway slave. The old man's voice was calm, assured, claiming he had seen nothing. Had been cooking his midday meal and heard the commotion but knew nothing about any escaped woman. The overseer's voice cut through the others, aggressive and threatening. He did not believe the old man, suggested that free blacks who helped runaways could find themselves back in slavery or worse. The old man did not respond to the threats, simply repeated that he had seen nothing and invited them to search as thoroughly as they wished. Margaret held her breath in the darkness below, certain they would find the trapdoor, certain this was the end. But the old man had hidden it well, and the men eventually gave up their search, warning the old man that they would be watching him and that if the runaway showed up, he had better report it immediately if he knew what was good for him. The dogs were harder to convince. They continued to circle the cabin, sensing that their prey was near but unable to locate her exact position. Eventually, the handlers called them off, deciding that the woman must have passed through the clearing and continued into the forest beyond. Margaret listened as the sounds of the search party faded, but even then she remained frozen in her hiding place, terrified that it was a trick that they were waiting for her to emerge. She clutched the water jug the old man had given her and took small sips, rationing it carefully, unsure how long she would need to remain hidden. It was several hours before she heard the furniture being moved above her and the trapdoor opened, admitting blessed light and fresh air. The old man's face appeared in the opening, and he gestured for her to come up. Margaret climbed out with difficulty, her injured ankle having stiffened badly during the hours of immobility. The old man caught her as she nearly fell, supporting her weight easily despite his apparent age, and guided her to a chair near the fire. He introduced himself as Isaiah and explained that he was a free man who had purchased his freedom 20 years earlier and now lived alone in this cabin on land he had managed to buy through decades of careful saving. He was part of a network, he told her quietly. People who helped escaped slaves make their way north to freedom. The cabin had been built specifically with the hiding place beneath it. And over the years, Isaiah had sheltered dozens of people fleeing bondage, providing them with food and rest and directions to the next safe house on the route north. Margaret wept then, the first tears she had shed since childhood, overwhelmed by the kindness of this stranger who risked everything to help people he did not know. Isaiah let her cry, understanding that she needed the release, then gently examined her injuries and pronounced them serious but survivable. He cleaned and bandaged her wounds, bound her ankle properly, and gave her food and water while explaining what would happen next. She would need to stay hidden in the cabin for several days, he told her, until the immediate search died down and her ankle healed enough for hard travel. Then he would guide her to the next station on the underground network, a journey of perhaps 20 miles to the north where a Quaker family maintained a farm that served as a waypoint for people heading to freedom. From there, she would be passed along to other helpers, moving in stages all the way to Pennsylvania if she made it that far, though Isaiah warned her that many did not complete the journey, that the odds were against her even with help. But Margaret had already decided that she would rather die trying to reach freedom than give up and return to bondage. She told Isaiah what she had done at the wedding, the poisoning that had set this whole chain of events in motion, and watched his face carefully to see if he would judge her harshly for it. But Isaiah only nodded slowly, his expression grave but understanding. He had seen too much of slavery's brutality to condemn someone for striking back, though he also understood that her actions would bring increased scrutiny and violence down on all enslaved people in the region. That white society would use this as justification for even harsher control. They talked long into the night, Isaiah sharing stories of other people he had helped escape, the triumphs and tragedies of the underground network. He told her about Harriet Tubman, a woman who had escaped slavery herself and now returned repeatedly to the South to guide others to freedom, risking her life over and over because she could not rest while her people remained in bondage. He told her about Frederick Douglass, who had escaped and become a powerful voice for abolition, using his intellect and oratory to attack the institution of slavery in the court of public opinion. These stories gave Margaret hope that her life could have meaning beyond revenge, that if she survived, she might be able to join the fight against the system that had stolen so much from her. The days passed slowly in the cabin. Margaret's body gradually healed, the worst of her injuries becoming manageable if not entirely recovered. She helped Isaiah with small tasks around the cabin, cooking and cleaning, grateful for the ability to repay his kindness in some small way. They avoided the topic of what had happened at Ashford Hall, but news filtered in through other members of the underground network who stopped by the cabin. The poisoning had killed 6 people, including Richard and Catherine Ashford, both sets of parents and 2 other family members who had sat at the head table. Another dozen guests who had drunk from the poisoned bottles had survived but suffered permanent damage to their internal organs. The reaction in Savannah had been exactly as Isaiah predicted. White society was in an uproar, demanding that the perpetrator be found and punished publicly. Enslaved people across the region faced increased scrutiny and violence as authorities tried to extract information about the poisoning. Several people from Ashford Hall had been arrested and tortured, including Bessie, the head cook, and 2 other kitchen workers, though none of them knew anything about what Margaret had done. Josiah had been whipped nearly to death but had revealed nothing because he genuinely knew nothing, having had no knowledge of Margaret's plans. The news of this suffering because of her actions weighed heavily on Margaret. She had known there would be consequences, but hearing the specific details of innocent people being punished for her crime was almost unbearable. Isaiah counseled her against guilt, reminding her that the real responsibility lay with a system that dehumanized people to the point where violence seemed like the only option. But Margaret struggled with the knowledge that her revenge had caused suffering to people who had shown her kindness. As her ankle healed enough for travel, Isaiah began preparing her for the next leg of her journey. He gave her new clothes, simple but sturdy, and shoes that would hold up better than the ones she had worn from Ashford Hall. He taught her which stars to navigate by, which plants were safe to eat if she ran out of food, how to recognize the marks that indicated safe houses versus dangerous areas. He drilled her on the story she should tell if stopped, a carefully constructed lie about being a free woman traveling to visit relatives, complete with fake papers that he had obtained from a forger in the network. On a moonless night 10 days after her arrival, Isaiah woke Margaret before dawn and told her it was time to leave. They ate a simple breakfast together, and then Isaiah led her out of the cabin and into the forest, moving along paths that were invisible to Margaret but that he followed with the confidence of long familiarity. They walked for hours, Isaiah setting a steady pace that accommodated Margaret's still healing ankle, stopping occasionally to rest and drink from streams they crossed. As the sun reached its peak, they emerged from the forest into cleared farmland, and in the distance Margaret could see a neat farmhouse surrounded by fields ready for harvest. Isaiah pointed to the farmhouse and told Margaret that was her destination. A family named Patterson lived there, Quakers who opposed slavery on religious grounds and had been helping escapees for years. Margaret should approach the house from the east, he instructed, and knock 3 times, pause, then knock twice more. That was the signal that would identify her as someone in need of help. Isaiah would not go with her to the farmhouse, he explained, because his presence would only draw attention if he was seen, and they had already taken enough risk by traveling together in daylight. Margaret embraced the old man, trying to find words to thank him for saving her life and giving her a chance at freedom. Isaiah patted her shoulder gently and told her to save her thanks until she actually made it to freedom, because there were still hundreds of miles and countless dangers between her and safety. Then he turned and walked back into the forest, disappearing among the trees, and Margaret was alone again, facing the next stage of her impossible journey. She approached the Patterson farmhouse carefully, watching for any signs of danger or deception, and knocked as Isaiah had instructed. The door opened to reveal a woman of perhaps 40, plainly dressed in the Quaker style, whose face showed surprise but not fear at the sight of Margaret on her doorstep. The woman, who introduced herself as Rachel Patterson, quickly ushered Margaret inside and called for her husband, a tall, thin man named Daniel, who appeared from a back room and assessed Margaret with the same calm acceptance his wife had shown. The Pattersons explained that they maintained what they called a station on the Underground Railroad, providing shelter and assistance to people fleeing slavery. They could keep Margaret for a few days, they said, giving her time to rest and recover her strength fully before the next leg of her journey. They had a hiding place in the barn, more sophisticated than Isaiah's trapdoor, where she could conceal herself if slave catchers came searching. And they would provide her with supplies for the road ahead, food and water and blankets that would increase her odds of survival. Margaret stayed with the Pattersons for 3 days, hidden in the barn during daylight hours, but invited into the house after dark to share meals and conversation. She learned that Rachel and Daniel had 5 children, all of whom knew about the family's activities and kept the secret with religious dedication. The youngest, a girl of perhaps 8, reminded Margaret painfully of children she had known in the slave quarters, though this child's future was secure in a way theirs would never be. The Pattersons talked openly about their opposition to slavery, citing both religious conviction and simple human decency as their motivation for breaking laws they considered unjust. On the morning of the 4th day, Daniel Patterson hitched up his wagon and concealed Margaret beneath a false bottom he had built for exactly this purpose. He would drive her north to the next station, he explained, a journey of perhaps 30 miles that would take most of the day. It was risky to transport her this way because if they were stopped and searched, she would certainly be discovered. But it was faster and safer than having her walk, especially given that slave catchers were actively searching for the Ashford poisoner and would be scrutinizing any black person traveling alone. The journey was terrifying. Margaret lay in complete darkness beneath the false bottom of the wagon, unable to move or stretch, barely able to breathe in the close confines. She heard Daniel stop several times to talk with people they encountered on the road, heard him cheerfully discuss crops and weather while she remained frozen beneath him, praying that no one would look too closely at his wagon. At one point they were stopped by men who claimed to be looking for a dangerous escaped slave, and Margaret heard them questioning Daniel aggressively, demanding to know if he had seen any suspicious black people in the area. Daniel maintained his calm demeanor, expressing sympathy for their search while firmly denying that he had seen anything unusual, and eventually they allowed him to proceed. When Daniel finally stopped and opened the false bottom to release her, full darkness had fallen and they were at another farmhouse, this one belonging to a family named Morrison. Margaret climbed out stiffly, her body aching from hours of immobility, and found herself greeted by a middle-aged couple who welcomed her with the same matter-of-fact kindness that the Pattersons had shown. The network was real, she realized with growing hope. There were people all along the route north who were willing to risk their own safety to help strangers escape bondage. It was almost impossible to believe after a lifetime of experiencing nothing but cruelty from white society. But the evidence was undeniable. The pattern repeated itself over the following weeks. Margaret would stay at a safe house for a few days, recovering her strength and allowing any immediate searches to die down. Then she would be passed along to the next station on the route. Sometimes she traveled by wagon, hidden in various clever compartments that conductors had built. Other times she walked, guided by people who knew the paths through forest and swamp that avoided roads and towns where she might be spotted. She moved steadily north through Georgia and into South Carolina, each mile taking her farther from Savannah and closer to the promised land of freedom. But the journey was not without setbacks and dangers. Near the border between South Carolina and North Carolina, the safe house she was supposed to reach had been raided by authorities just days before her arrival. The family who had been operating it was in jail, facing charges of aiding fugitives, and Margaret had to hide in the woods for 3 days until a new contact could be found to continue her journey. She ran out of food during that time and was reduced to eating plants and roots, some of which made her violently ill. She developed a fever that left her weak and delirious, and she later had only fragmented memories of being found by a black woman who was not part of the underground network but who took pity on her and nursed her back to health despite the risk. Winter was approaching as Margaret made her way through North Carolina and into Virginia, and the weather became another enemy to overcome. She had only the clothes the various safe houses had provided, adequate for southern weather but insufficient for the cold nights that came with autumn's progression. She developed a persistent cough that worried the conductors who sheltered her, who feared it might be consumption but had no way to get her proper medical care without risking exposure. She lost weight she could not afford to lose, her body burning through its reserves as she pushed north through increasingly difficult terrain. There were moments when Margaret wanted to give up, when the pain and exhaustion and constant fear seemed like too much to bear. She thought about turning back, about accepting that maybe bondage was preferable to this endless struggle toward an uncertain future. But then she would remember the wedding at Ashford Hall. Remember the feeling of pouring poison into those crystal glasses. Remember that she had already committed herself to this path by striking back against her oppressors. There was no going back now, only forward toward whatever fate awaited her in the north. The underground network moved her through Virginia, Maryland, Delaware, each state bringing her closer to the goal of Pennsylvania and freedom beyond. She met dozens of people who helped her, both black and white, people who were motivated by religious conviction or political belief or simple human compassion to defy laws they considered evil. She heard stories of other escapees, some who had made it to freedom and were building new lives, others who had been caught and returned to face brutal punishment, still others who had died on the journey, their bodies left in unnamed graves along the route north. It was late November, nearly 3 months after the poisoning at Ashford Hall, when Margaret finally crossed into Pennsylvania. She was traveling with a conductor named Jonas, a free black man who made regular trips south to guide people north, and he told her when they passed the border that she was now in free territory, that the laws here did not recognize her as property. Margaret wanted to feel joy or relief at this news, but she was too exhausted and too changed by her journey to feel much of anything. Freedom, she discovered, was not the single transformative moment she had imagined, but rather a gradual shift, a slow realization that she had agency and choices that had been denied her entire life. Jonas brought her to Philadelphia, to a community of free black people who had established themselves in the city and who welcomed fugitives from the South. They provided her with lodging in a boarding house run by a formidable woman named Grace, who had herself escaped slavery 2 decades earlier and now dedicated her life to helping others make the same transition. Grace took one look at Margaret's condition, the lingering cough and extreme thinness and haunted eyes, and immediately set about the work of helping her recover both physically and mentally from the trauma of her journey. It was in Philadelphia, in Grace's boarding house, that Margaret finally allowed herself to process everything that had happened. She mourned the life she had lost, the people she had left behind, the impossibility of ever returning to Georgia or seeing Moses again if he was even still alive. She grappled with the guilt of the poisoning, the knowledge that her actions had resulted in deaths and suffering, trying to reconcile her belief that the act had been justified with her horror at the consequences. Grace listened to her story without judgment, understanding that moral clarity was a luxury that enslaved people could rarely afford, that survival sometimes required terrible choices. Over the following months, Margaret slowly rebuilt herself. She found work as a seamstress, using skills she had learned in bondage to support herself in freedom. She learned to navigate the complex world of free black society in Philadelphia, which had its own hierarchies and rules that were very different from both white society and the slave communities she had known. She made friends cautiously, still not entirely trusting that her freedom was real, that authorities would not suddenly appear to drag her back south to face punishment for her crimes. News from Savannah filtered north through the underground network. The search for the Ashford poisoner had eventually been abandoned, authorities concluding that the perpetrator had either died during the escape attempt or had been killed by accomplices who wanted to ensure her silence. Ashford Hall had been sold, the family unable to bear remaining in the house where so many had died. The building stood empty for years afterward, locals claiming it was haunted, that they could hear sounds coming from the abandoned structure on quiet nights, sounds that some described as sobbing and others as laughter, the ghost of the wedding that had ended in death and destruction. Margaret heard these stories with mixed feelings. Part of her was glad that the Ashfords had suffered, that their grand house had become a monument to their loss rather than their power. But another part, the part that had grown and changed during her journey north, understood that revenge had not actually solved anything, had not freed a single person still held in bondage or changed the fundamental injustice of the system. She had struck a blow, yes, but it was a small blow that had cost tremendously and accomplished little beyond satisfying her own rage. As years passed and Margaret built a life in Philadelphia, she became involved in the abolitionist movement. She spoke at small gatherings about her experiences in slavery, though she never revealed that she was the Ashford poisoner, keeping that secret locked away. She helped with the underground network, providing shelter and assistance to new arrivals, trying to give back some of what had been given to her. She learned to read better, improving on the basic skills Moses had taught her, and she read everything she could about the fight to end slavery, the political debates and moral arguments and economic interests that tangled around the question of whether human beings could be property. She learned that Moses had died 2 years after her escape, worked to death in the fields of the Pemberton estate. This news broke something in her that had not been broken before, the knowledge that the man who had saved her in so many ways had not been saved himself, had died in bondage while she lived in freedom. She mourned him properly finally, allowing herself to feel the full weight of her grief, and she promised his memory that she would continue the work he had started, teaching others and fighting for freedom in whatever ways she could. Margaret never married, never had children, choosing instead to dedicate herself fully to the cause of abolition. She became known in Philadelphia's black community as a woman of fierce conviction and practical compassion, someone who could be counted on to help people in need but who did not suffer fools or tolerate injustice. She lived to see the beginning of the Civil War, watched as the nation finally began to confront the evil at its heart. Though she did not live to see slavery's end, dying of consumption in 1862 at the age of 50. At her funeral, attended by dozens of people whose lives she had touched, Grace told the story of how Margaret had arrived in Philadelphia all those years ago, broken and haunted but determined to survive and build something meaningful from the wreckage of her past. Grace did not mention the poisoning, keeping that secret even after Margaret's death. But she spoke about courage and resilience, about the strength required to survive bondage and the even greater strength required to build a life in freedom. She said that Margaret had been a warrior in a war that most people did not even recognize was being fought, and that her life stood as testimony to the truth that oppressed people had always resisted their oppression, sometimes quietly and sometimes violently, but always with the fundamental conviction that they were fully human and deserved to be treated as such. The legend of the Ashford Hall poisoning persisted long after the facts had been forgotten. The mansion remained abandoned for decades, becoming a landmark of sorts in Savannah, a cautionary tale about the dangers of trusting enslaved people with access to food and drink. Some versions of the story turned Margaret into a monster, a savage who had murdered innocent people out of inherent evil rather than justified rage. Other versions, whispered among black communities, portrayed her as a hero who had struck a blow for freedom, though these stories were careful not to include identifying details that might lead authorities to any living person. In truth, Margaret Ellis was neither monster nor hero, but simply a human being who had been pushed beyond endurance and who had lashed out with the only weapon available to her. Her story was one of thousands, millions even, of enslaved people who resisted their bondage in ways large and small. From work slowdowns and tool breaking to outright rebellion, all of them trying to claim some measure of autonomy in a system designed to strip them of every human right. The fact that her act of resistance involved killing made it more dramatic than most, but it was no less justified or understandable given the context of her life and the society that had enslaved her. The Ashford Hall building was finally torn down in 1893, or some 58 years after the poisoning that had made it infamous. Local newspapers ran stories about the demolition, recounting the legend of the murderous slave girl who had poisoned a wedding feast and escaped into the night. These accounts were lurid and inaccurate, embellishing details and inventing motivations, turning a complex human tragedy into simple melodrama. No one mentioned that the bride had been essentially sold to the groom by her bankrupt father, that the whole system of plantation slavery was built on violence far more extensive than one woman's desperate act, that perhaps the real monsters were not the enslaved people who occasionally struck back, but the society that kept them in bondage in the first place. What remained was the story, passed down through generations, evolving with each telling. Some said if you visited the site where Ashford Hall once stood, on certain nights you could still hear the sounds of that ill-fated wedding, music and laughter suddenly cut off by screams. Others claimed to have seen a figure moving through the overgrown gardens, a woman in a tattered servant's dress pouring invisible wine from an invisible bottle. These were ghost stories, of course, the kind that every society tells to process trauma and establish moral lessons, but like all ghost stories, they contain kernels of truth wrapped in layers of mythology. The truth was that Margaret Ellis had existed, had lived and suffered and fought back and escaped to build a life in freedom. She had killed people and saved people and educated people and loved people, all the complex contradictions that make up an actual human life rather than a simple story with clear heroes and villains. She had been brave and cruel, calculating and desperate, victim and perpetrator, all of these things simultaneously, because that is what humans are. Complicated and contradictory even under the best circumstances, and infinitely more so when forced to survive under conditions of systematic dehumanization. Her laughter, if it echoed anywhere, echoed not in the ruins of Ashford Hall, but in the lives of the people she had helped during her years in Philadelphia, in the small acts of resistance and resilience that she had encouraged in others, in the chain of influence that extended forward through time as each person she helped went on to help others. That was her real legacy, Not the melodramatic tale of poisoned wine and murdered aristocrats, but the quieter story of survival and community, and persistent struggle toward freedom and dignity. The story of Margaret of Savannah remains a complicated one, a reminder that history is written by the powerful but lived by everyone, that the same events can be understood in radically different ways depending on whose perspective you take, that moral certainty is difficult to maintain when examining the actions of people living under impossible conditions. Was she justified in poisoning those wedding guests? From her perspective, almost certainly yes. From the perspective of the families who lost loved ones, obviously no. From the perspective of history, the question itself is perhaps less important than what the story reveals about a society that drove human beings to such desperate measures and then expressed shock when those measures were occasionally employed. What can be said with certainty is that slavery was a moral abomination that corrupted everyone it touched, enslaver and enslaved alike, that it created conditions where violence became inevitable, where human beings were forced to make impossible choices between submission and resistance, both of which came with terrible costs. Margaret Ellis chose resistance, and she paid for that choice with the loss of almost everything she had known, with a lifetime of exile from the place of her birth, with the knowledge that her actions had caused suffering to innocent people even as they struck back against a guilty system. If her ghost truly does laugh in the ruins of Ashford Hall, perhaps it is not the triumphant laughter of revenge satisfied, but the bitter laughter of someone who understood too late that individual acts of violence cannot destroy systemic oppression. That true freedom requires not just escaping from bondage, but dismantling the structures that make bondage possible in the first place. That work continued long after Margaret's death, continued through the Civil War and Reconstruction and Jim Crow and the Civil Rights Movement, and continues still today. An ongoing struggle to make real the promise of human equality that was written into founding documents but denied in practice to so many for so long. The story of Margaret Ellis, slave girl who poisoned the wedding feast and left 100 guests gasping for air, is ultimately a story about power and resistance, about the lengths to which people will go to claim their humanity when that humanity is systematically denied, about the complicated legacy of violence in the face of oppression. It is not a comfortable story, not one that offers easy moral lessons or clear heroes, but it is an important story nonetheless, a reminder of the real human costs of slavery and the desperate measures that enslaved people sometimes took to assert their existence as fully human beings deserving of freedom and dignity.